Hey, welcome to another episode of an ongoing series where we look at all the differences between a singular game across different regions. But this is the first time ever I'm covering Kirby, and to make up for that, we're going to be covering multiple games across the series and highlighting the most interesting changes between those games. So let's look at the first game in the series, Kirby's Dream Land. So the first thing I noticed is something that's not documented anywhere on the internet, which is really interesting. It's that there seems to be a glitch in the US version that's not present in the Japanese version. It's only at certain times, but it's guaranteed if you start up a brand new game that if Kirby bumps into something very early on in the stage, the US version of Kirby has no little stars to indicate that impact, whereas in the Japanese version, that issue is not present. And again, that isn't to say that there isn't impact stars for the US version, it's just for whatever reason there's a trigger later in the stage that allows it to happen, whereas in the Japanese version, it happens right away. Next up, we're going to talk about this screen here. Now for every stage transition, there is a logo in the lower right hand corner, and obviously there's the Japanese logo, and then there's the US logo. And the sprites for those logos are a little bit different. There's more verticality to the US one, and it's more horizontal for the Japanese one. And interestingly, this somehow affected this particular screen transition, Green Greens, where there's a lot more real estate for flowers next to the logo. Both versions only have 3 flowers on the bottom of the screen, but the position of the third flower is completely different between the two versions. I'm a little bit surprised by this change, but I'm assuming it has something to do with coding. It keeps things stable, maybe. It's also, of course, possible that for whatever reason, they thought this change would look a little bit nicer, but I somehow doubt having 2 flowers directly next to each other somehow looks better. And then this change is really cool, but before I even talk about it, I just want to say thank you to the cutting room floor. A lot of what you're seeing here was cited from that website. There will be a link to it in the video description. Thank you so much to the folks over there. Anyways, if you activate configuration mode, you can see that the logos are different in the background. We'll get into that in a little bit, but the very big change here is that you can adjust the vitality of Kirby, and the Japanese version left behind a beta element that was not used in the final game, making Kirby's vitality meter more spherical than the squarey version that is used when you play the game. So for the US version, they went for the trouble of adjusting this so that it matches the vitality meter in the actual game. And there's a couple of differences for the ending too. At the end of the credits, you can see that there was a major adjustment to what was owned by and licensed to. I guess in the original Japanese version, it's written out to say, presented by HAL Laboratory Inc., licensed to Nintendo. But I'm assuming that Nintendo must have bought the rights for this game and made an adjustment for the US version to better reflect that, where it says Kirby's Dream Land presented by ... HAL Laboratory Inc. and Nintendo. Not only that though, but Kirby in the original Japanese version would hold up a sign that had Japanese characters on it. If you were to translate that sign, it would say the end. However, in the US version, the text was completely changed to bye-bye with English letters. Also, this screen that tells you about the extra game is completely different between the two versions. The English one says clearly, good job, press up A and select on the title screen to start a new adventure. Good luck. But in the Japanese version, it starts with a heart symbol to kind of give you the indication you're supposed to read this in a cutesy sort of way. And it says, clear, congratulations. Input the command at the title screen. Let's go on a new adventure. Which I think the biggest difference of all, of course, is that the arrow facing to the left is more trusting of the player to interpret the directions on the image, rather than explicitly say it. And then the title screen between the two games are very, very different. Something that you'll see is a recurring theme here. In the US, we have a blank background with a unique image of Kirby on top, and then it has that great animation of a row of Kirbys dancing around with the star that sort of flies around in front of the logo. In Japan, though, you get to see the background of Green Greens, and the title screen reads Hoshi no Kabi, which in English translates to Kirby of the Stars. And this naming convention persists in Japan all the way to current day. For example, Kirby in the Forgotten Land in the US is known as Kirby of the Stars Discovery in Japan. And next I want to talk about Kirby's Dream Land 2's title screen, but before that, let's talk about today's sponsor, Bai. Seriously, you're going to want to hear about this if you have any interest in retro gaming merch. For example, I'm showing you all sorts of different types of merchandise that Kirby had back in 1993 all the way to 1996 that was not sold in the US. And the easiest way to browse and buy these items are through Bai. See, what Bai does is it takes your US dollars and converts it to yen, and also allows you to visit Japanese online auction sites like Yahoo Japan. And because the Japanese language isn't too well known outside of its own region, most of these sellers are only going to sell to other Japanese people in Japan, but what Bai does is they take your item to their warehouse where they will ship it to you internationally. And if you sign up right now, you can use this link to get 10% off your first purchase. The link will be in the pinned comment as well as the video description. Thanks, Bai. Anyways, Kirby's Dream Land 2, like I said, has a very different title screen. This time we get it in color, and the US has a great color scheme using blues and yellows, as well as bubbles and stars. It even features a dancing Kirby that's not featured in the Japanese version. However, over in Japan, it says Kirby of the Stars 2 and features unique Kirby holding on to a 2 that is not featured in the US version. And another little interesting fact is that Hoshi no Kabi 2 has its logo in the Super Game Boy border, whereas Kirby 2 does not have a graphic whatsoever. Instead, it just stripped it out completely. Okay, and now I hope you guys are strapped in, because this is a roller coaster of a rabbit hole that I went down, and now you guys get to all experience it with me. US players, maybe not. You experienced at one point in your playthrough this girl blob. It's like a girl version of Gooey, and may or may not be the major influence, if not the same character as Choo Choo from Kirby's Dream Land 3. And if you do run into this character instead of Gooey or one of the animal buddies, you end up getting a 1-up, as well as 1% towards your completion goal. Now, why are we talking about this character? Because in Japan, it's a completely different character. Introducing Chao. You may notice that Chao looks like a little Chinese girl. And you would be right. And why was Chao changed to this girl blob? Well, Chao is very obviously themed in Chinese culture, and American audiences just weren't quite there yet in terms of accepting things that came out of Japan that were centered around Japanese or Chinese folklore. And so there's actually multiple instances where Chao was replaced by this blob. It's honestly kind of staggering how much work they had to put in to make that change happen. But I'm not even done talking about this yet. Chao is not just a character that came out of Kirby. She actually belonged to her own game on the Famicom Disk System, which is the equivalent of the Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan. She was one of the main characters in a game called Yuyuki, which is a game that is just drenched in Japanese folklore, and is loosely based on the Chinese novel that you've heard about a million times now called Journey to the West, something that the original Dragon Ball is also derived from. I actually mentioned all this for a purpose. I played the game for 4 hours for this video just to get to this one scene. This screen right here was actually used as a direct reference in Kirby Dream Land 2's sound test. I wanted to play the game so that I can better describe to you what is happening in this scene. So for a majority of this game, Yuyuki, you're playing as Goku as well as these 3 other characters here. And even though you're first introduced to Chao at the very start of the game, you don't play as her for 5 chapters. It's kind of wild. But it's at this point in the game that you finally meet back up with Chao. And the setting that these characters are in is a cruise ship that they managed to board upon. And they're all hanging out in a lounge in this cruise ship about to sing karaoke. That's why there's a piano. To the right of her is actually a soundstage, and everyone's just enjoying some beverages on a couch. And now with all that said, let's go back to Kirby of the Stars 2, and you can see that the screen is an exact replication of the first screen where you find Chao again. You can even see her in the background playing piano, just as she did in the original game Yuyuki. You know what, just for my own dumb fun, I'm going to take this screen here, and I'm going to match it over the Game Boy version screen, just to show you guys that it's almost pixel for pixel remade for Kirby's Dream Land 2. And there is some differences in things like the coloration, as well as a couple of pixels off of a couch, and obviously the characters that are being displayed here. Now, with all of that said, this room remains untouched in Kirby's Dream Land 2 for the US. However, once again, Chao is swapped out for the pink blob, and also threw in Gooey next to the piano. And I do want to mention this real quick because I'm sure a lot of you are kind of like, wait a second, I remember this character for some reason. And if you're one of those people, it's because Goku and Chao were actually featured in Kirby's Dream Land 3. The localizers did not bother changing that whatsoever. So that was US players' first exposure to Yuyuki, I guess. And the sprites for things like Goku here are actually derived from the game itself as well. I already happened to capture footage of this so you can take a look at it if you'd like. I know I spent a lot of time talking about Yuyuki in a Kirby video, but I have one last question before I move on to the next game. As a region break episode, would you guys be interested in seeing a video completely dedicated to games that were owned or created by Nintendo for the Famicom that never released outside of the region? Because I had a ton of fun playing Yuyuki for a little bit and learning a lot more about the series, and I'd be more than willing to go into a couple of more of those games if my audience is interested in that. Just let me know. But anyways, with that said, let's move on to Kirby Superstar. Or is it Kirby Super Deluxe? Or is it Kirby's Fun Pack? That's right, UK viewers, I got your back this time. Okay, so first let's talk about the differences between the UK version and the US version. Obviously, in the UK it's called Kirby's Fun Pack, whereas in the US version it says Kirby Superstar. The apostrophe S is missing from the US version, but otherwise everything seems to be the same. I will just go on to say real quick that you guys in the UK got the best name for the game. I think it illustrates perfectly what makes this title unique from the other Kirby games, whereas the other titles don't. Speaking of other versions, let's talk about the Japanese version now. The title of this game is Hoshi no Kabi Super Deluxe, with Super Deluxe being written out in English underneath the subtitle. You might also notice that the emblem is more cartoony looking, whereas the emblem for the US and the UK version seem to almost look like a pre-rendered 3D object. Also, here's a little fun fact for you. The licensing information for each version has a different colored bar that's meant to accentuate it. The US version has a reddish looking one, the Japanese version has a purplish looking one, and the UK version has an orangey looking one. Next up is the controller graphics, and I cannot believe that they went through the trouble of changing the graphics for every single controller for every single region. So this is what a controller looks like in Japan. This is the Super Famicom controller, and this is what it looks like in the game. It's a perfect recreation of a Super Famicom controller, right down to the logo and the button colors. You move over to the US, and there is a purple and lighter purple or pink combination of buttons, and this is what it looks like in the game, right down to the Super Nintendo logo, like I said. And then here's the wildest thing. The UK also has a different controller. Yes, it has the same color layout as Japan, but you might notice that if we shift between the Japanese version and the UK version, the logo's changed because it's supposed to say Super Nintendo, not Nintendo Famicom. And that's reflected yet again in the actual sprite work. They even went through the trouble of changing the tiny little controller icon in the lower right hand corner, even if those words are completely illegible at that point. But the most hilarious thing of all is that after all that trouble that they went through for the UK version to have its own special controller, they used the US translation a little too faithfully, and in that dialogue they still say it's that gray thing with the purple buttons. Nice job. Man, what a bummer. But while looking at the differences between the US controller and the Japanese controller, you might have noticed something that's a little bit different. Over in the US, there's a hot dog on this stand, and in Japan, there's a sushi. Well, once again, to match the culture that this game released in, any food that was Japanese-centric got changed into something that was American-centric. Here's a couple of examples that were here in-game so you can see it for yourself. But for the rest of them, I'll flash an image on the screen that was once again provided by the cutting room floor. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to list off the foods that was changed for the US. We got pancakes, cherries, pineapple, I think? God, help me with that one. Lobster, french fries, a sandwich, a summertime drink, a cookie, flan, peas in a pod, and a candy cane. And here's a really funny and weird one for you. I don't think any of us in the US would have cared or taken the time to notice, but what we got in the US was two halves of Kirby coming together for the screen to ask you about a tutorial, whereas Japan gets this thing called the Shoshinja mark, which according to the cutting room floor, the way it's described here is it's supposed to be for newbies or new drivers. And lastly, I want to go over some box art differences. Sadly, I don't have any of these in physical form to show you like I do in past episodes. If you'd like to support that for future episodes, I have a link in the video description to either become a patron or a YouTube member. But for now, here are some images I found off of eBay. The first of which being Kirby's Adventure on the NES versus the Japanese release. The box art is completely different, with the US side breaking the fourth wall and sucking up the label on the box, whereas the Japanese version has a pink Kirby with a pink Famicom cart, which is a nice touch. Kirby's Dream Land 3 has similar art to the Japanese version, except for the fact that it has more traditional line art, whereas the Japanese box looks like it's made out of craft. Also, the cart label is different from the box art, featuring very simplified art, which is really cool looking. Obviously, we just talked about how Kirby Superstar is very different between regions, and the box art is definitely no different. You just saw the English version there, and then the Japanese version has a burnt-in wood look. I have to say, I've never quite seen a Famicom box that looks like this. That was a very, very interesting choice. Very primitive looking. And here's the big reason why I wanted to have this segment. I wanted to share with you the exact moment in which Kirby in the US starts to get what I like to call angrification. And so to kick that off, we saw that first in 2002 with Kirby, Nightmare in Dreamland. In the US, he's featuring the fighter headband and of course looking menacingly with Meta Knight going on in the background. However, in Japan, he's got a nice little cute wand and is looking chipper as ever. And it also looks like the Fountain of Dreams is behind the logo instead of Meta Knight. Kirby Air Ride, it was in 2003, the year that Reggie touched down as president of Nintendo of America. Once again, looking angry on the box. Whereas in Japan, very similar looking, however, no angry eyes. You would think that maybe Kirby Triple Deluxe also had this angrification. No, this is actually an instance in which the Japanese side also wanted him to have an angrier look. I also wanted to share with you guys the last time we had a Kirby angrification that was deliberate by the US localization team, and not just the artwork that was used by default in Japan. That game would be Kirby's Return to Dreamland. The artwork on the Japanese side is completely different. No Sword Kirby, just regular old Kirby, and again, super happy and chipper. Also, you might notice that the title of the game in Japan is not Kirby's Return to Dreamland, but instead it's Hoshi no Kabi Wii. Anyways, big thank you to the patrons as well as the members for keeping these shows alive. I appreciate you deeply. If you want to become a member, like I said, there's links in the video description. It helps out a ton during at this time. But outside of that, just want to say thank you. Take care.